Mr. Brown. My name is Hoshana Sanders, and I host a YouTube channel for about my obsession with Black books called Black Book Stacks. And I have like a regular writing and reading newsletter, but I've been a journalist for about 20 years. Oh, this is the part where my puppy decides that he wants to squeak his toy. This is what because I'm trying to be professional and like, do my Oprah thing. And he's like, I'm about to drop this toy at your feet. Um, so anyway, I loved reading This Is Not For You, an activist journey of resistance and resilience. I see that the cover is right there behind you as well.
It
So
is.
excited to talk to you about it. Well, first of all, I wanted to ask you what the reception's been like for you in the book. Both,
Overwhelming.
yeah.
Overwhelming. Yeah, when we started this, I didn't think I had a story in me. So it surprised me. And then realizing that other people that thought they knew me were surprised also. It was overwhelming, yeah, to
So,
say the least.
for those who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, can you tell us a little bit about what it is about and how it came to be?
Well, how it came to be is probably the place to start. Throughout my activism, um, it's always been difficult for us to get folks involved if they're not directly offended by something. A lot of folks are satisfied to let somebody else do it. But the challenge is to have folks around concerned about this stuff and doing something about it all the time. And it's been a difficult path. And around police issues, it's even more difficult. And I retired from the Air Force, and we use checklists, so we don't have to think about anything. We use checklists. You check this off, and then you go on to the next step. And I thought, well, that would be the answer because it did me well when I was in the service until it didn't, And so I was looking for somebody to help me do that. And for maybe 3 or 4 years, and it wasn't an aggressive look. I'd run into people that I knew were writers. I talked to them about what I wanted to do, hoping that they would say, oh, we'll help you. And that never happened, right? And these were people that I knew had those skills. It wasn't like I was going to somebody sleeping on the street and saying, listen, I want to do this. Can you help me? I thought I was going to folks who had the skills and couldn't find anyone. It was too much for the folks that I talked to. And I met there was a situation about one of our streets here. And some young folks came and talked to me about it. And I thought they were going about it all wrong. So we had this discussion, and I guess they went back to their leader, and he wanted to talk to me about what I thought they should be doing. And in getting to know each other, there was a lot of small talk. And I mentioned the fact that I wanted to do this checklist. And the next day, I got this from Brian, or a couple of days afterwards. And we made a date to sit down in a restaurant, had lunch, 3-hour lunch talking about it. And we left, joined at the hips. So it's been the process has been long and gut wrenching and more than I wanted to do. And in the beginning, I thought we were doing too much. But he was the writer, so I kind of left it up to him. And I'm talking about 3 years old, when I was 3 years old. Now, what does that have to do with a checklist? And it finally turned out that it wasn't a checklist. It was more than that. My story was more than that. And so we went on this journey. But another reason was I spent a lot of time at the police academy here. And I go to the graduations, and there was a graduation 3 or 4 years ago. And this youngster came to see a relative graduate. And he came from California. And at the graduations, I tried to impart to the relatives, the friends, the folks that are close to the officer, the role that they need to play in making this person a decent cop, you know. And the youngster came up to me after it was over, and he said, how do I do what you do? And I thought he wanted to be a cop and thought I was a cop. I said, well, I'm not a cop. He said, well, I don't want to be a cop. You know, I didn't know what to tell him, because in all my years of activism, nobody's come up and asked me, how do I get where you are? How do I do what you do? And you know, that's been a big problem, because we seem to not be able to pass the information on. And as a result, we end up fighting the same battle exactly the same way every time something happens. You know, so I was, he kind of motivated me to want to get this done. And it's done, and I don't even know his name, you know, because I would want to send it to him.
Yeah.
So that he would be able to do it. And I've been trying to figure out how I can find out his name. I don't even know his office's name. So, you know, it's probably something he's going to have to pick up in the newspaper and say, oh, I know that guy. And then if he calls me, I can send him one.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully he'll see this.
Sure, I hope so.
Or
and he was like 16 years old, ripe. You know, that's where you got to start doing this, because as folks get older, they've got their own lives to live. And even if it's something that they're concerned about, they don't want it to be a lifelong journey. And my approach to it doesn't have to be. You know, all you need to do is be sensitive to the issues, and then you'll pick up something that you like to do. And then most of the book is, how do you maintain that desire to keep doing it?
Right. Well, that's a nice segue, I think, into my question for you, Brian, which is that, you know, you and Mr. Brown seem to be opposites, maybe?
We both got, he's white and I got white hair.
I did it for the joke, waiting at the end of me that observation, so thank you for not disappointing me. So, Brian, I guess I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your motivation in telling the story, and how you approach shaping a life that seems on the surface to be very different from your own.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, we are very different. I mean, Mr. Brown, as you get from the book, grew up in Harlem in the 40s, I guess. And I grew up in a Wisconsin town of about like 8 people in the 80s. Obviously, you know, racially and in terms of just so much of our lives, we come from very different places. And in terms of my motivations to work on the book, when we got introduced, it was this friend that Mr. Brown mentioned, who just let me know that there was this person who was looking to write something and needed some guidance. And so I didn't go into that lunch knowing that we were talking about a book either. This was early 2017, so not too long after Trump was elected. And I was in a moment where I was just trying to figure out, what are some different things that I can do with my writing? I had principally written memoir. I was just trying to think if I had, you know, any positioning with who I am in this world and what I can do with my writing, where I can do something a little different. I wasn't thinking about that when we sat down together. I really just kind of figured I would hear what Mr. Brown had to say and see if I could connect him to a resource in the community who might be able to help him with what he was looking to work on. But yeah, over that 3-hour lunch, I mean, anybody who reads the book knows that Mr. Brown has lived this just remarkable life and has done and been so much. And I've always been interested in learning more about Portland history, Portland Black history, how the city has been shaped and changed. And I was just really inspired at the end of that meeting. I'd never thought about doing something like this before, but it was just kind of, it was one of those moments where it felt like a really exciting thing to do. And then I gave myself a little bit of space afterward to think about that. And because Mr. Brown was saying that it ended up being a bigger process than he expected. I think it did for me too, but I had written a book. And so I know that committing to writing a book is years. But it just felt right. So I got very excited about it, and then we started the process. And in terms of trying to figure out how to translate his story into a written book, we spent about 6 months just doing interviews. And so we get lunch every week and we'd record it. And then I would transcribe it, which is, I'm not a trained journalist, so not a thing that I've done a whole lot of before, but just getting as many quotes that possibly good, and kind of, blocking out an outline of what the book might look like eventually based on that. And talking a bunch about if I had an idea about how I thought the story could maybe look. We ended up with this kind of braided structure of a back and forth between now and then and Mr. Brown growing up. We would talk about it at the lunches and just kind of see how the form and the arc of the story sounded. And yeah, and then just spend as much time together as possible while preparing it. And then in the writing, it was really a process of me getting it down on the page and trying to be as conscious as possible in the writing process of all the different, biases and all the privilege and all the ways of seeing and moving through the world that are me, right? And that don't belong in his voice and his story, and then missing a bunch of it too. And I think Mr. Brown probably read the book 4 or 5 times and was able to give feedback on everything from, like me using way too much profanity to a moment where it was clearly my emotional response to a situation rather than his. There was this one moment after a lot of work around divesting the city of Portland, divesting from South Africa, where I wrote this, like big sweeping end to a chapter about how totally devastating this moment was. And Mr. Brown's response after reading what I'd written was like, I mean, if you're Black in Portland in the 80s, you're used to having challenges and to having losses, and you move on to the next fight and keep going. And, recognizing that was a place where I, as a person who I get conditioned to get my way much more often, I was more devastated by that story, I guess, and took it in a different way. So there were all these different ways that even if I thought that I understood how I was, even if I thought I was conveying his experience, that I would creep in. And, we did as much as we could to take that out, but we've been having conversations over the past week about like the way that the voices are still both apparent in there. So I think we did the best that we could, but a big reason that both of our names are on the book is we wanted to be clear rather than in a lot of ghostwriting scenarios that like 2 people did this together. And I'm one of them, and I'm going to tell the story in a particular way. So just, being upfront about that and letting people know.
Yeah, I laughed. I smiled during the profanity part because one of the things I was struck by was that, I appreciate your transparency about, there being 2 voices and it being clear. I actually don't know that I see the differentiation that much. I mean, I think, Mr. Brown, your voice or your demeanor came across to me like it reminded me of my dad. My dad served, he was a veteran and he was pretty straightforward. I mean, it just kind of like that was he said what he said, and then then we're gonna move on, And so I felt like, yeah, that feels right. I mean,
Interesting though.
yes,
That's interesting because a lot of the people, we talked about that forever, about 2 voices. And some of the people that have talked to me about it really could tell the difference, and saw how the book was done. They all recognized my voice when they were reading it. And when they heard Brian's voice, it was like him adjusting the camera, as he says, the lights, all of that stuff. One guy told me that he could tell Brian was setting up the next comment, the next little talk that I would have, So it became not an issue, I thought anyway, because it's not a bad thing the way it was explained to me
right.
by
No,
people who read it. So I thought it kind of stopped me from worrying about the other voice,
right.
because everybody recognized the role that the other voice was playing.
Well, the other thing too is that, writers often say this. And I don't know if you've heard it, Brian, but like once you write a book, it belongs to the reader, right? It doesn't really belong to you anymore. So that's a weird thing when it's your story
Mhm.
because
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
like, well, it does belong to me because it's my life, but it's still, the way that it's interpreted, you know,
right.
basically belongs to the reader. So whatever
Mhm.
they say is basically that's how you know that you've done your work, and
Yeah,
you know,
yeah. One of the things just recently I was told that this guy had, and this was a person that I knew in passing. I didn't know him real well. We our paths cross all the time. We say our hellos, and he said, "Richard, I was sitting down." Call me Mr. Brown. He said, "Mr. Brown, I was sitting down reading the book, and I thought you were right in the room with me." To me, that says a lot about the quality of the writing.
yes,
My brother, I just talked to him yesterday, and he said, "Richie, it took me right back to 128th Street. I anticipated some of the things that you would be saying." Now that's someone who's close to me, you know, but people got it.
yeah.
People got it, and it wasn't objectionable.
Mm.
Yeah, I loved, speaking of Harlem, which has come up a couple of times, which is exciting because I live right across the bridge from Harlem.
Mhm,
And I also am working on a book that is a lot about history. And
mhm,
it has some New York history in it in the 40s. And so it was really
mhm,
exciting to read about that period of your life, but also seeing the names of Black photographers that I love who are
mhm.
influences of yours. So, Mr. Vandersea, James Vandersea, but
Yeah,
also Roy Carava. It was heartbreaking though to read the description of your being in the other room away from Mr. Vandersea.
yeah,
Though was
yeah.
that
It was,
to recount?
but his wife was so accommodating. She would run back and forth to let him know what was going on. It was really heart wrenching because I looked forward to seeing him.
Yeah,
But it just reminded me of the old folks when I was growing up.
right,
You didn't come out in your bathrobe,
right,
and she said that if he doesn't have on a jacket, his tie, and a corsage, he isn't visiting anybody. So I mean, it was a great experience, and it let me know that the way I live my life is a throwback of all of that stuff.
right.
So it was great. It was great. Yeah.
So let me ask you about another aspect of the book, which is about travel, your
Hmm.
time in the service, and then you ending up in Portland. So
Hmm.
I'm really curious about why you stayed in Portland when you could have lived anywhere. And I think you maybe like approached this a little bit in the book, but I'm not sure that you really. I might have missed the part where you really said
I
why.
I stayed in Portland because I'm a New Yorker. I love New York, but I knew that I couldn't live in New York and live off of my retirement.
Mm, I see.
So my intention was to go back to Europe. And when I retired, I came to Portland, and my girlfriend at the time found a job for me, and then we ended up getting married. And after a year, I think every place I've been, I was always going back. But you get over that after a year or so. So it was I easily got over it. It was easy to live here. And that's it. And I got involved in what was going on here.
Right. So speaking of that, then this is another good segue, other pros. So we're nearing a year since the uprisings in response to deaths like Kendra James's, which you mentioned in the book, and then also, of course, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others, the hands of police. And so I guess I'm wondering, given your expertise as an activist and as a journalist, and really like as a witness, what are your thoughts as we approach this sort of anniversary of another racial reckoning, right? Because there have been many of them.
Mhm. Just that. There have been many of them. And, I've become kind of immune to the excitement that comes around them, especially as I get older, because I'm not going out there and throwing stones and all of that. So, um, I just try to get the folks to understand that the history is these things happen. Everybody's angry. We march, we do all of these things, and then it gets dark and we all go to sleep and we wake up like nothing happened. And then some years down the road, there'll be another explosion and we do the same thing. So as I've gotten older, going out there and being visible, I just don't do that anymore. And it gives the young folks a chance to attack these problems. The bad part about it is sometimes I feel like it's no different than the first incident I was ever involved in. So we aren't growing. And one of the reasons they don't last long is because we don't do anything different. They figure out, well, they're going to be out there marching for however long they march. So we'll figure out how to get that out of the way. And then they'll all go back to sleep. And we've got a history of doing that. And I think that the book was made for police and young activists. Young activists need to know that there's history, and they need to know the history. You don't have to do it the way someone else do it, but you need to know what didn't work so that you don't do that again. And that's what I tried to do in the book. Let folks know that there's a continuum that they need to at least be aware of. If you're going to do something, figure out whether anybody's done it before. And if they had, why didn't it work? You can do the same thing if you figure out why the energy dissipated. And a lot of times we don't do that. A new crop of people comes up. And one of the things I've learned is that you become cynical, or I've become cynical, because we repeat the stuff. And you invite me to a meeting and you ask me what I think. And you may decide, well, I don't want any part of this, because, I'm telling them how I feel about it, what I may have done, what I think they should be doing. And pretty soon you've overwhelmed them. And I think for me, the idea is to let them learn it the way I learned it. Nobody told me what the answers were. What they did was they did what they do, and I watched them. And I realized that in my life, nobody's ever sat me down and said, Richard, this is what you should be doing. This is how we did it. Sometimes they may say, well, read this book. Well, if I want to turn off a faucet, I don't want nobody to tell me to read this book. Just tell me how you turn off the faucet. And I think that as I've grown older, I did the same things. So I made mistakes or did things, didn't utilize the history, didn't utilize the people who had been fighting these battles. Most times didn't even recognize them. So the result was, I probably did things that were written to fail. And I didn't, I want to help young folks not fail as much. You're gonna have your failures, but it doesn't have to be because you didn't have the history. You didn't talk to people who had been involved. Since the book has come out, it's the young people that excite me, because they're not asking me, well, what was the impetus for the book, or what's your next? They want facts. They want to know, how do you do this? How did you do that? And it's amazing because, they come wanting to talk about the book, but in fact, their questions are questions they have about what they're doing. And that's exciting to me.
Yeah, that is exciting. So I want to just my second to last question for you is about that and the ending of the book. But I'm also just curious, like, do you think you're gonna really retire?
I'm retired.
It seems like you tried to retire. You've been trying to retire since you were 45. It seems like you're not really retired.
No. When I get up in the morning, when I get up in the morning, when I open one eye and see it's light outside, I make a decision whether I'm going to do anything that day, unless I've scheduled something. And I try not to overwhelm my schedule. You know, from day to day, you can call me and I'll have some time for you. You know, so I'm retired because I do what I want to do, and I do it when I want to do it. So that's retiring for me. I've never been someone to lay out on the beach for the obvious reasons. There's no reason for me to lay out on the beach. You know,
I would argue that there's always a reason to lay out on the beach if that's your thing. You like the ocean, but
I guess, but you find people who have time for that. I hear you, but you find people who have time for that.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. I think I'm retired. I think just because I can decide 5 minutes before I walk out the door whether I want to walk out the door.
I was just asking because it just occurred to me that several times in the book you were like, I retired and I did it, and then you're like, but then I got this other job. Or then I started doing this activism work. And then I started taking photographs for the newspaper.
See, the problem is taking pictures for the newspaper that's what I like to do, you know. And when people know you're retired,
right,
they know they can call you.
That's right.
So you can be retired and your phone is always ringing because somebody always think you need something to do.
I see.
But for me, no is not a question.
It's a full
no is a sentence.
It's a full sentence. It's a
full sentence.
By itself.
By itself. And I don't have any problem with no.
That came across very clearly in the book. That is very clear that no is not an issue that you have at any time.
That's right.
At any time in your life, which I appreciate, because I've always had issues with no. And people understand it was a full sentence.
People still think, you know, but and my problem is I'm not taken in by all the technology. So when you call me, the only way I'm gonna know you called me is pick up an answer because I don't have caller ID. You know, I don't have, I have a message, but I never keep the date is never on it, so I don't know when you called.
This is why you look so peaceful. You don't even look your age. This is why, because you don't have caller ID. This is not on social media. I got it. I'm gonna be drinking water and probably trying to figure out how to get caller ID off my phone.
That's it. I do what I like to do. You know.
That's good.
And you know, for the most part, it entails young people, includes young people and older people. You know, one of the sad things about it was growing up, we never sat around and talked about my mom and dad's childhood. And I regret that today, you know. And so one of the things I do with young people is I try to get them to talk to the old folks around them. And for the old folks to be open to having that conversation, you know. And I think that we don't think we have anything to tell them. We have a lot to tell them, you know, just because we've come so far, you know. When in '56, when I went in the service, the life expectancy of a Black man was 56 years old, you know. And maybe that's why, you know, people didn't live long enough to sit down and have those discussions. You know, they worked hard. My dad worked like a mule, you know. My mom worked, and there was no effort to pass on our history. You know, I have a cousin who's the only child, so she was always around her mother when the old folks were having those discussions. She wasn't included in it, but she was there, so she heard it. But around my mom and dad, we didn't live in a close proximity to the grandparents. So the only time we heard any of those stories were on Christmas when we all got together, and then as youngsters, we didn't know what they were talking about, and it really, they didn't include us in the conversations either, so I think that's something we have to do a better job of.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you raise a good point. I mean, one of the things that is um, striking about your book, especially in this time, in the context of the activism that happens now and what young activists experience now, is the narrative of Black people in America really is steeped in this trauma, this intergenerational trauma, and that every story about us, even I noticed this, and I think other people noticed it too, on like Hulu and Netflix and some of the streaming services, that when they started to curate these collections of Black stories, all of the stories were like slave narratives,
Right.
or like, had police brutality at the center, or some other kind of wounding experience. And so I think the absence of having that conversation with your elders, or having even elders to talk to or to hear their stories, combined with the fact that most of the popular culture stories that we hear, in the absence of having those connections or those stories, is a story of pain. It is a story of struggle. It is a story of trying to survive, or you can't even thrive in the struggle. You just have to like get through the struggle and overcoming and all those things. Even when you think about like civil rights, it's very much a narrative. How do you overcome? How do you persevere? How do you just get from moment to moment, as opposed to thinking about, how do I age well in a healthy way so that I have something to contribute to my community for a long time, like over a long period of time. So I think it's interesting that you frame that by talking about life expectancy, because obviously the health disparities that we see in COVID and related to all kinds of things still exist.
Yeah, and we speak about health. Nobody said, Richard, you're going to live a long time, and if you want to live a long time, this is what you have to do. When we lived on the 6th floor in Harlem, so we stayed healthy because we ran up and down those stairs all day. But
the 4th floor walk up. So I know.
When I was in the service, for some reason or other, I got hung up on the obituaries. We had the Air Force has an organ that comes out every week, and they list the deaths of service people, ex and current. And I recognize that, and this is within the first couple of years of being in the service, that old people, not old people, pilots, and especially pilots, live to be a long time. 30, 40 years after they retired, after 30 years. Enlisted men, though, didn't live as long for the most part. And it had Black and white. Race had nothing to do with this statistic. And the first thing I decided to do, because I went in the service with the intention of staying 20 years. So I wanted to at least live long enough to retire. So what were these pilots doing that people who weren't pilots doing? And it had to be about physical, it was about physical conditioning. They were in the gym all the time. Flying airplanes is a rigorous job. So so much he fell asleep.
I'm here. I guess we're still recording.
Good.
Sorry about that glitch.
Oh, no problem.
It was my internet that cut me. That.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. I thought I put you to sleep.
No, I would have said something.
Oh.
So you were talking about pilots getting exercise and being in the gym all the time.
And being in generally good shape physically.
Yeah.
They may get diseases, but according to the Air Force Times, they were living 30, 40 years after they retired.
And
So I wanted to be like them. Huh?
You believe the Air Force times, obviously.
I changed my lifestyle. I'm 82 years old, and I don't know very many guys still around I grew up with or I was in the service with.
Right.
So,
well, that's saying something.
I think so. And I'm still trying to break the government.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that, I think. So I was really moved by the ending of the book and your call to action for readers of your book. And, for us to ask, and how are the children, I think is a good question. I'm wondering if you have additional advice for those of us who are trying to navigate this historic time.
I think for folks who have the experience, you got to stay involved in some way. I like being around young kids. I build model cars, so in the past, I've gotten kids over at the Boys and Girl Club, young boys and girls, taught them how to build model cars. I encourage parents to take their children instead of send their children. Those are the things that I think we as older folks, we need to display what it is we want them to do, to be and to do. And in doing that, I think that we have done them a great service. I think absent that, all you're going to do is sit around and grow old. So I think that at some point, you become the teller of the story. And you tell it in a way that's not preachy and encourages folks to get involved, young people to get involved. And I mean, it's never so clear to me that that's the way we have to do it. And you can't be too old not to do it. I know when I first came to Portland and got involved, it amazed me how many mature citizens I would run into, and may have known them by name or may not have known them at all. And they always knew what I was doing because they were watching. And when I came in their presence, if I could have done something differently, they would mention it. But it was always encouraging. Keep it up. Don't stop. You got a gun? All of the questions they asked, and it was like I had all of these godparents running around, keeping an eye on me. So it was great. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to encourage these young folks. And you never know how it's going to manifest itself. I used to go into the high schools and middle schools and present pictures, and I'd always turn it into a conversation about growing up, and I would always give my business cards to the youngsters because I believe that parents don't have all the answers, and they may not acknowledge it, but they need all the help they can get, raising their children. And I always feel like you have to be in the life of a young person that's not related to you, because if you're related to them, you don't know nothing about their lives, But they listen to strangers. So I used to give these kids, youngsters, my cards, and I'd give more business cards out to these youngsters than the people who are going to hire me to do anything, right? And years later, I'm in a fast food place, and this young man comes up to me. He said, "Oh, you're Mr. Brown, aren't you? The photographer?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, you don't remember me, but when I was in middle school, you used to tell us about finding out what it is you're passionate about and just doing it, And he said, I wanted to design athletic clothes, those suits that they wear. And he went in his pocket and pulled out this card that was curved to his little butt. He'd been sitting on it so long. And this is years later. You never know how you impact people around you.
You cracked me up. Okay.
And that's the game. That's the game. That's how we keep moving. We encourage them, and it's the little stuff. It's little stuff. I've worn a bed all the time, a long time, and I keep it trim. And I dress like I'm still in New York a lot of times. And I was in a mall, and this youngster came up to me, and he said, "Man, I like the way you got your bed cut." And I'm getting ready to thank him, and I looked at him, and he had just gotten his bed shaped up.
I see.
So I stopped him, because he was going to go on. I said, "Man, you sure got that hooked up." And you could see he just stood up, and that was the end of the conversation. But you got to be able to pick the little things, because those are the things that encourage folks to go on. I wear bow tie and jackets a lot. And I was at a luncheon, and this young sister walked up to me. She said, "Mr. Brown, how can I get my boyfriend to wear a jacket?" I said, "Is he here?" Because I was going to talk to him. He said, "No." I gave him my card. I said, "Have him call me." I didn't get a call, but that's what you do. You become what it is you want them to be. There are no acknowledgments in the book other than to my mom and dad, because there are not very many people that I have met that haven't influenced my life in some way. And it wasn't because they sat me down and talked to me. It's because I watched them. You don't get old, and that's the end of it. So we can always find ways to be involved in whatever movement people want to be in.
You may have noticed that my little homie just jumped up.
I see that.
He just jumped up in my lap because he's used to sitting here while I write. So he was like, "You're not gonna be in here without me." So
Hey, buddy.
here I am, and say hi, Mr. Brown, and okay, all right. Well, you want to say hello to you too. So now we're busy. Okay, let me put you back down.
Bye-bye.
The year-old going on 25.
Been here before, huh?
I think so. He thinks
Pretty mellow looking for a year old, though.
Oh, he's not mellow at all. He jumped.
He's like children. They know how to act when company's around.
Oh yes.
Takes it well for a minute.
Just people have treats and they call him cute. No, he knows how to put it on, and then when everybody's gone and all the lights are off, he's jumping all over things and being crazy. So, but that's why we love them. My only other question, Mr. Brown, is, is there anything I didn't ask you about that you think is important to mention? And I think the same thing goes for you too, Brian.
The thing that's important to me is that when I was, the people that I talked to about writing the book, they were all Black. Never even gave it a second thought that somebody white would do it, much less could do it. And we got to figure out these partnerships that make things happen for us. There are not a lot of people who did anything by themselves. So we got to spend time developing those relationships and being aware that you can't do it by yourself. I think that's the big thing. A lot of times when young folk come to me, all they want me is rubber stamp what it is they want to do. They usually get surprised when they come. And we've got to be forceful about that. We can't let them come and rubber stamp something that we know doesn't could be done better or differently. You at least need to give them the options. And I tell folks, you can ask me something today, and you think I'm wetting in the wind, but you can come to me tomorrow and ask me something else. And I'm gonna tell you something else tomorrow. You know, we can't take it personal when we give somebody advice and they don't use it, or they move on and it doesn't appear they're using it. Because I think that whatever you tell them goes in the old hard drive, and they may be walking down the street and stumble. Oh, that's what he was talking about. You know, so and that's been my life. People have told me something, my parents in particular, that I thought they were talking out the back of their head. I tell folks, the older I got, the smarter they got. You know, so
That's a good thing. I like that.
mhm.
I did have one thing to add in response to a question you had from Mr. Brown earlier about when he was going to retire. And, you know, we were in the process of writing this book. I must have asked that question or some other version of it 1,000 times. And it was usually after we'd gone through, you know, talking about when you led the 18 months worth of foot patrols on Beach Street, you know, 5 hours every single night walking on a foot patrol. And, you know, while we're hearing about this, meanwhile, and maybe, you know, in a place in my life where I'm pancaked on the floor, can't move half the time, and I'm just like exhausted. And the idea of going and doing something else is so much. And I come to our meetings and just be like, what about the nights that you just didn't want to leave your house, you know, when you were exhausted? And it was like, basically there was a look on your face, Mr. Brown, that was like, does not compute. And I think that and that kind of connects to to another thing that you were talking about. Just, I think you're talking about trauma and how so many Black stories center around trauma. And I found that so many of Mr. Brown's stories obviously are centered around and connected to that, but around joy too. I mean, the joy that you bring to so much of your life and to the stories that you've told about your life. That was what struck me the first time we met, was that you're such a good storyteller and you have so much, just clearly everything that you've been doing in your life, you have passion for and joy around. And I think you've talked about this with photography, but the travel stories and so much of what came up even in the hardest years in the military, of, you know, like rounding up rattlesnakes and all these stories that would just kind of come out of the woodwork. And I feel like that's the thing that I picked up in I think that Mr. Brown doesn't retire because he still has this passion and drive for what he's doing. And it's a reminder to me that I want to direct my energies towards those things that I don't have to pick myself up and force myself to do, but those things that I'm just gonna do, you know, that they just feel like second nature. And it's been such a joy for me to see somebody who decade after decade after decade just continues to do the thing that on the innermost level they know they want to do.
Yeah.
You know, you got to have things that you like to do. You know, one of the things that I tell police and their families is, because they're not going anywhere, so we got to figure out how to indoctrinate them to something other than what they're learning, is that you make a list of the things that you like to do the day you leave this academy, you and your significant others. You write down the people who are in your life that you enjoy being around and the things that you like to do. And every 6 months or so, you go back to that list and you make sure that you're still doing those things. You know, when it gets too much for me, I get my camera out and I don't care about anything else that's going on. I take pictures. You know, I enjoy that. I do so many things that finding something to keep me busy without having to deal with other people or other issues is easy for me. Easy for me.
Listen, you're talking to an only child who is an outgoing introvert, so you speaking my language. It's like, I'm like, oh, this is great. I'm making a list as soon as I get out this call about things I need to be keeping myself occupied with that I enjoy. But speaking of your pictures, probably one of the most, I guess, emotional parts to me of your book, or seeing the pictures of Black women from like this, I don't know, the 80s maybe. Is that when you took those photos? A lot of those photos, so beautiful. I think there was just like a short, you know, sort of passage where you're talking about the importance of Black women to movements and also
Mhm.
to communities. And, um, you know, unfortunately, I haven't really seen a lot of examples of that in a memoir about
Mhm.
activism, from an elder. So that was
Mhm.
really moving, I think, to see not just the photographs, but also the respect and the,
Mhm.
just paying, just honoring them, in
Mhm.
that way. So it was really lovely to see that.
And that came about at a time when um, we've got some thoroughfares in the street that in the community that prostitutes were always on, and the women were being hassled by prostitutes. And Portland. Um, if you were to land here in a spaceship, you might not know that any Black folks here, because if you pick up a newspaper, if you don't go to the sports page or the crime page, you don't see any Black folks. And my thing is not to present that negative image of people, you know, that there are folks here that live good lives and may not get on your radar. All over the world, that exists. But for some reason or other, we want to take pictures of the gruesome parts of our community, the folks who didn't find a way, and for as many as those that you see, there are twice as many that didn't succumb to all of the junk that goes on. And another one of the things that's important is when you have a victory, you got to have a party. No matter how small. And for me personally, one of the things when I run into a challenge, I don't try to solve the whole thing. That's what the Foot Patrol did. Drugs and crime are all over the city. Well, I can't patrol the whole city, but I can pick a spot and I can do something on that spot and have impact. And then when you finish with it, you get together and you eat some chicken, you get greasy mouth and greasy fingers, play some music, and everybody's happy. And that makes you want to go on to the next project. So that's an organizing thing. You know, we did that a lot here, do it a lot here. So um, there are easy ways to get through this stuff and it not beat you up. But it's real easy to get beat up by it because you invest so much of yourself in it that you don't see anything else. And sometimes you become cynical. And that's where we get in situations where we're fighting each other. We're all walking down the same road, but we're fighting all the way, and we're not realizing that we're on a treadmill. We're not going nowhere. So
Yeah, I mean, I think, to one of your earlier points about the lack of transferring information or knowledge or stories, narratives really down through generations has to do really with, all of the models that you see for, I mean, you mentioned not really having models, but all of the models that younger generations behind
mhm,
you have seen of what it looks like to be a leader or an
mhm,
activist at a local level or even on a national level have all been assassinated or somehow discredited or somehow, or like broken really
mhm,
by the work. And so it's wonderful to have a counter narrative
yeah,
that is like, well, you can actually sustain yourself
mhm,
if you think
yeah.
maybe more holistically about your life, um, instead of tunnel vision.
Mhm, mhm. I did a group around photography and activism, and my whole thing was, we know what being down and out looks like. We need to be able to raise the folks up that are involved in whatever it is we're doing. And the way you do that is you show them enjoying themselves. You show them not getting beat up by cops. You show them doing the things that people do. One of the things that I learned during Frederick Douglass's times, he was probably the most photographed person in the world. And he understood. And you never see a negative picture of Frederick Douglass. He understood how important those images were. You know, but everybody's got a cell phone, but they're waiting for somebody to get run over by a car to take a picture, or they're taking pictures of themselves. You know, and you know, they should be taking pictures of the things around them, everything around them, if they're gonna do it. You know, but you know, like, it's a fad, and it soon shall pass.
That's right. Well, this has been really lovely. Thank you so much for taking time to talk to me about This Is Not For You. Just incredible. Where can folks get it?
Amazon, your local bookstore, the grocery store, the restaurant, in case any restaurants and grocery stores are listening. Anywhere where books are sold.
Amazing. Very good. Well, thank you both so much.
Thank you. I thank you very much.
Thank you.
As you can, I enjoy talking about this stuff, you know, and again, I made a date about 5 years ago when I was celebrating my birthday in a restaurant. The restaurant owner was kind of talking to some folks who were there for a party also. And he mentioned the fact that it was my birthday also. So the guy he was in his 50s. And he came up to me, he says, well, how old are you? I said, I think I was about 80 then. He said, well, when I'm 80, I sure hope I look like you. I said, well, why don't we make a date? We'll meet back here and we'll check it out. He was 50. So I still got a few more years to go.
That's funny.
So if you want to live long, you got to act like it.
That's right. That's right.